Welcome to the EHHS Research Council webinar. My name is Christine Pytash, and today we're focused on grants and grant writing. Todd Hawley will be our moderator, and we're going to start by having our panel introduce themselves. So Angela, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Angela Ridgel, and I'm an associate professor in the exercise science department in the School of Health Sciences. My research is mostly focused on using exercise interventions to help people with neurological disorders, specifically Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis at this time.
All right, now we'll have Lisa introduce herself next.
Sure. I'm Lisa Borgerding. I'm an associate professor of science education here in TLC, and my research area focuses primarily on evolution education, but also on science teacher preparation.
All right, and Phil, how about you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Phil Rumrill. I'm a professor of rehabilitation counseling and director of the Center for Disability Studies here at Kent State. Most of my research focuses on the education and employment of people with disabilities.
All right, and Trish, how about you round us out?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tricia Neese. I'm an associate professor in qualitative research and anthropology and education. And my work focuses on cultural processes involved in educational change. And in particular, I'm interested in social movements in educational change and professional movements in educational change and educators' experiences in those kinds of movements.
All right, thanks everybody. I'm Todd Hawley. I'm an associate professor in the School of Teaching, Learning, and Curriculum Studies, and I'm in secondary social studies teacher education. And as the moderator today, my goal is to try to make this as conversational as possible. So if when you're answering the questions, if you have a question for another one of our panelists, please feel free to ask it. And we will start off with our first question, which is, what advice would you give about finding likely funders?
Well, Todd, I'd love to start because one of the things I've found really quite helpful at Kent State and in our college is the fact that there are a lot of resources. In particular, in our college, we've got Michelle, who is our grants person, who, if you work with her, she'll offer dozens and dozens of different resources, from emails about grants to help with writing grants to budgeting. And then at the university level, there are folks who do a similar thing and provide lots of announcements about grants. We have a system database that allows a lot of different kinds of searches for grants. So from my perspective, all of those resources are really vital, especially if you come from a background like I have where you haven't had experience prior to becoming a faculty member. All of those kinds of resources are extremely helpful in searching for grants and writing grants.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that because I think Michelle and her office have been extremely helpful. Once she's got you in the database and knows what your research interests are, she's really great about plugging you into some opportunities. Another thing that I would add is like getting to know people within your field, especially people who are leaders within your field, and like just to see kind of what path did they take with respect to grants. I mean, most of the people in my field started off with some internal grants and then moved on to some like Department of Education grants and then eventually applied for NSF grants. And so you can kind of see which ones did they apply for and in what sequence. You know, did they have to be a full professor to apply for some things, or was it better to apply for some smaller things earlier on? So those are some ways I've kind of gotten a feel for which ones are good in my field.
Right, and then I'll add to that. I mean, I think I'm more of the clinical person here. Obviously, our focus is NIH is kind of what everybody wants, but there are also a lot of small foundation grants, especially for clinical stuff and other fields also. And there's some websites out there that can help you find those. They're Foundation Center kind of compilation websites that you can go in and put your research focus, and then it'll look through a database and pull up those foundation grants. And then also, as far as specific, you're looking at specific disease states or specific populations, A lot of foundations will have grants through, those mechanisms. So, say for Parkinson's, if you search for Parkinson's Foundation, there are 4 or 5 foundations that actually give grants at different levels: students, postdocs, senior and lower level faculty grants. And so that's a good way to do that too. And then kind of an overall, federal foundation, grants.gov is a website too that you can go to on your own.
I think along with all of the excellent comments my colleagues have made already, I think it's also very important to make yourself known to funding agencies and also to people who are doing research in those kinds of areas. So find out from your colleagues around the country where they're getting their funding. Join on to grant-funded projects to every extent that you can. If somebody asks you to serve as a evaluation consultant or something on a project like that, any access to funded projects prepares you really for the next project that you might take on. I also think it's important to get involved as a reviewer or a member of a grants advisory board for funding agencies. Certainly they have these available through NIH and NSF and various offices of the Department of Education, the kinds of funding agencies we all use here in our college. And I think becoming a grant reviewer is a very important function there. It's a great way to learn how to write grants by reading what other people do. Also, some funding agencies, such as the National Institutes of Health, NIH, have developmental programs where first-time investigators can get involved for sometimes a small one-year project or pilot project. Other funding agencies I'm aware of have these small pilot projects to get first-time investigators in the pipeline. The National Multiple Sclerosis Society has such a program, for example, and quite often that's a good way to get started. But any opportunity to get involved in funded research always, I think, prepares you for that next step, and not only identifying those possible funding agencies, but getting actively involved in the process by which grants are administered.
All right, so before we move on and talk a little more about the actual proposal process, is there anything else that you would add? So I know that some people mentioned working with Michelle in our college or with Yvonne Thomas. And Phil and Angela, you really mentioned some ideas of getting involved more nationally, even through grant organizations. But I guess I'm curious, if I find out about a funding source and it sounds like it fits well with the research that I want to do, what really should I do next, right? So if you're learning about the process, most of you immediately work through Michelle or Yvonne, or do you work directly with the funding agency? I guess I'm trying to think of people who are brand new to this.
Right.
Before we talk about the writing, what about this finding and then moving forward towards actually going for the grant?
Well, I think it's valuable. I mean, especially if you're going to go for NIH or something along those lines. One thing that's kind of challenging is if you find kind of a general announcement for funding, sometimes they're not very specific for a particular line. But you can go and you can actually search on, NIH has the reporter website, and you can go search for similar grants. And then those will kind of give you an idea about where you should focus as far as the funding agency, because NIH, has National Institutes of Aging, they have the Neurological Institute, so you need to kind of find, first of all, where your project's going to fit in that, and you can do that by looking at the reporter website. And then if you find a particular institute, you can actually call them and talk to somebody at NIH to help you out, to make sure that you're kind of focusing your effort, or you have an idea of generally what they would fund. And then I would actually start working through Michelle.
I think those are some really excellent suggestions. Like NSF also reports their previous award winners, and reading through what other people have been awarded is really helpful, because then you can see kind of what's valued, right, within the organization, what seems to be kind of a hot topic or hot area of topics. And then if you're doing something similar, you can reference or reach out to that group involved, like you'd mentioned, and then you can kind of find out, what kind of feedback did you get on this project. Most people have been really helpful when I've reached out and asked, like, what were some of the pitfalls, and what are some of the things that you were really happy that you're working on. I think people are usually pretty happy to share.
Yeah, I reiterate that from the perspective of writing grants for foundations. The foundation that I've worked with doesn't publish much about the grants it awards, but it does give you titles and names so that you can reach out to people you might know, and having those models, I think, are the most helpful thing. So working in multiple areas at once, looking at models, looking at what's been funded just in terms of the titles and topics, working with Michelle at the same time, getting the initial work done with her, and I guess just using all of that to kind of focus your efforts, and like Lisa said, make sure, and Angela said too, make sure your efforts are moving in the right direction from the beginning so you don't lose too much time.
Yeah, I think seeing a full copy of a proposal that has been funded by the agency you're seeking funding from is really, really important. And Michelle's office, and even our centralized research and sponsored programs office, they have copies of all the proposals that have come out of Kent State, and I find our colleagues here in EHHS are always happy to have you look at copies of successful proposals. So Michelle has those. It can also help in assembling proposals as well. If you can see a template, even if it's in a different content area, from a proposal that has been successful, or even one that wasn't funded but had high scores, I think most investigators are happy to share that kind of information. Boilerplate information on the resources section, for example. Anybody who's ever asked me to use any of that stuff, they can have it. If they can benefit from it, all the better. I think you have to ask, but it'd be interesting to see the 3 most recent NSF proposals that were funded, within the college, and take a look at them, and looking at a successful example so you can see what it requires in the way of scope and complexity and those kinds of things, I think would be very important.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next question and really focus on the actual writing of the proposal. So you found a funding source, you're really interested, and this is something I'm really curious about. So really, how fleshed out should an idea be when you start writing the proposal?
In my experience, it should be very, very, very fleshed out. Both times I've applied for funding from a particular foundation, the big difference was the first project I had the conceptual ideas, but the second project that one was not funded. The second project that was funded was one where I had lots of concrete specifics. I knew exactly where I was going when, and how I was collecting data, and who my resources were, and so in my limited experience, it was really having a very specific, concrete, fully fleshed out idea ahead of time for the kind of grant that I was applying for. That, I think, made a big difference.
I completely agree with Tricia there, because I've applied for a lot of grants. Some of them have been funded, some of them not. The ones that have been funded are usually the ones where I've really thought through, like, how is this going to look when it actually plays out, right? So what are the activities going to be? What's the evaluation going to look like? What's the time frame for the project activities? I've thought about the composition of an advisory board. I've thought about all the details so that then the funder and the reviewers for the proposal can take a look and say, yeah, this is probably doable. I've sat on the other end of that now, and I've reviewed proposals for NSF, and I see that, because sometimes you're like, that's a great idea, but I just don't know how you're going to do it. So then all those details, even though they seem really tedious, and you're kind of like, I can't predict the future, you want to try to nail down as much as you can so that they can see your vision better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that too. you really need to make it very clear to them that you know how to address your questions and that you're going to be able to answer them one way or the other, either positively or negatively. You know, if you don't have the exact protocols worked out, if you don't have a very specific population that you're looking at, I mean, even with the stats, you know, they want your statistics to be very well thought out. I've gotten dinged on the stats not being, you know, as fleshed out as they would like. And they love the idea and they love the protocol, but the stats kind of got them hung up. So you really need to have that all worked out. They want to be sure that you can not only address your questions well, but, you know, be able to do it in a timely way and do it in an efficient way. So I usually have my students, you know, to start with that. I have them start with just sketching out some research questions and then coming up, you know, with your aims of your project. That's the first thing you need to deal with. And then once you do that, you can start, you know, working on, okay, here's the question I want to address. How do I design my protocol to be able to address that specific question? That's the way I start and have my students start.
I might even argue that the logistics and the details of the proposal are actually more important than a good idea. If you think about how most the points or grant scoring sheets are allocated, you get, you know, 10 to 15% of the points for the concept and even the literature review and things like that. The majority of points are occupied by the plan of operation, the research design, your evaluation plan, your personnel, your plan for dissemination, technical assistance, you know, whatever the particular project might be. And so not only is, you know, it's good to have, you got to have a very good and conceptually sound core idea. If that's all you're contributing to the proposal, then you're going to miss points throughout the rest of your application. And so connecting that good idea to sound research design and activities and objectives that flow from it and fall within the time frame can be evaluated in the way that you propose, and that your institution has the resources and you have the resources as the investigator and expertise to carry out the project. Those become, you know, even more important. So it's in the details and it's in the way you fill out the form of the grant proposal that really results in more of the points than even the best ideas. And I think my colleagues have alluded to that the good idea is kind of you know, it's necessary but not nearly sufficient.
I'd like to add one thing to that too. Another thing that is really convincing, or at least has been in my experience, is to have even just a little bit of pilot data to begin from, so that the reviewers can say, yeah, you know, this person can actually carry out this work. These kinds of approaches will yield, you know, constructive results that may start to address these questions. And as a reviewer, I've liked that too because of that doability, just as Phil was saying. I mean, you start to feel like, okay, these people are equipped to handle this kind of project, even at a small scale.
All right, so clearly time is an issue here if you're thinking about learning about a proposal versus creating the ideas for your proposal and developing all those sort of things. So and I appreciate Angela talked a little bit about working with their students, but I'm also thinking, you know, I'm a new faculty and I'm interested in grants to help fund my work. How did you balance that? I have this great idea and I really worked out how I would do this study versus, hey, I've just seen this great funding source. I think I have a half worked out idea. I'm going to go for it. I guess I'm curious about that balance, because at this point you're all talking as people who have been successful with working and writing grants, and I'm trying to think about people who are very new in the process. I think a lot of it goes back to your sort of first answers about relationships with the grant funding, but can you talk a little bit about how you balance that I found this funding source versus I have a fully worked out idea, now I'm going to go out and search for funding? How did that work out in your start with grant writing?
Well, I think opportunism really plays a big role in this, at least to sustain a grant-funded program of research over time. this certainly doesn't apply to my colleagues, but I've only had so many good ideas, actually not that many. And part of it is, so two ways of going about a grant. One is you've got this great idea that lays itself out very nicely in terms of a research design and a set of operations, and then you go find the funding agency that just happens to match those priorities. The other is, as you mentioned, Todd, you see a set of priorities from the funding agency, you've got some ideas there, and in response to the RFP, you then flesh it out. Also a defensible way of going about grant programs, and sometimes you have to be, you could sit around for 20 years waiting for an agency to honor your good idea. Quite often you have to make your particular focus, maybe your population of interest, maybe your own favorite research design, fit with the priorities of the funding agency. So it's very important that you attend kind of in both ways. Think about those things you'd really like to do in terms of a wish list, and then looking at those RFPs that might fit to some extent with what you want to do, and maybe there's a variation of what you were thinking. And sometimes you bring other people who have expertise in that new population of interest or in this new method of analysis or whatever it might be. So it really has to come, I think, both ways, unless you're someone who just has an infinite inventory of really excellent ideas. I'm not, but I think that's very important to attend to what the priorities are and to be able to respond to them and to take those core ideas, those kernels of what you're most interested in, and making it fit the opportunity that's available to you. And sometimes that involves reaching out and meeting people who do things in a different way than you do, but I think that's equally important. You double your chances of getting funded, I think, if you're amenable to both of those ways of getting started.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Phil. One of the things I'm working on right now, my graduate assistant and I were working on a lot of things at the same time. So we're reading the literature, we're designing the study, and we're looking for funding all together. Each week we're trying to do a little bit in each of those areas. And so we're searching through the Kent State database that has funding opportunities at the very same time as this initial work and designing the study and reviewing the literature. However, I think one nice advantage in the field of education is the foundation I've been successful with in the past, the Spencer Foundation, is a foundation that only funds educational research, and so the advantage of that is that they fund a wide variety of kinds of studies and areas of inquiry in education. And so I guess the point I'm making there is if there's nothing out there that's directly a great fit for a particular study in education, the Spencer Foundation is usually a place to look for funding that you don't have to work as hard to fit their goals, because they do fund such a wide variety of things.
I was going to say, one of the things, because I think your question also asked about sort of how do you begin, how do you kind of get an entree into this grant writing, and one of the things that helped me a lot was working with really successful grant writers themselves, and so kind of partnering and collaborating, and that happened when I was a graduate student, but then definitely since I've been here, and that's also been a source of a lot of new ideas. There were a couple of projects that I've worked on that I would never have dreamed of on my own, because I'm also limited in my number of good ideas that I'm probably ever going to have. So it was really nice to collaborate with some other people and get a sense for, some new ideas and ways that we could kind of connect and synergize. But then also to work with those people who had more grant experience. The first time I applied for a big grant, I knew I was a newbie, and that was not going to probably, look good by the reviewers. So then I partnered with a lot of people who had already had NSF experience, and that was, I think, probably really helped our case, because they thought, oh, she may not have that experience, but some of her colleagues really have had that experience. So I think collaboration is really key for that.
Yeah, and I can elaborate on that. I mean, I obviously, had this good idea, and I needed engineers to help me, make that idea come forward. So I made the connection here through Kent. The technology office had a meet and greet for people in industry and faculty members, and I met some people at Rockwell Automation, and then they got me connected with people at Case in the engineering department there. So, part of that building your case for you being able to do that research again is, just like Lisa was saying, I would have never been able to convince somebody that I could do this engineering-based project, obviously, if I didn't have, the chair of electrical engineering at Case on the grant, and people who do control technology. So that just was just happened, and you need to just make sure you get out, you meet people, and you build your team as best you can, and that really is super important for kind of making your project go in one direction or the other, too. I would have never necessarily imagined that I would be doing what I'm doing right now when I first started at Kent, but it was this collaboration and meeting these people that made it go in that direction, and obviously that's what's been working for the lab, so I'm pretty pleased that that happened. But you got to go out there and you got to meet these people, and you have to be open to, making those connections.
All right, so I think really the remainder of our questions are really focused on advice and things you wish you knew and tips and those sort of things. And I know that we've talked about a lot of them, so we're going to not necessarily be all over the place here, but even in your last responses, there was a lot there. So hopefully we can come back to some of that. But our next question is, what are some things reviewers love or hate when they review proposals? And I think with this question, you can either talk about what you've learned they love or hate as somebody who has submitted a grant, or you can also talk about your work reviewing proposals, because I know that earlier in some of the responses you mentioned that the experience of being a reviewer has been also helpful for you in thinking about writing grants. So here we're talking about things that reviewers love or hate when they review proposals.
I can start. I could probably talk an hour about this from the reviewing end. I assume that I've upset a number of people with my proposals that I don't know what they would have said to me. But as a reviewer, I think because reviewers are reading so many of them at a time, it really helps to follow the RFP very closely in terms of using the same headings that they've used in their evaluation rubric that they provide. Also, if they're citing particular literature, that they've deemed important in the RFP, then you consider citing it also, so that you can show where you're in alignment and this is an appropriate fit for you. I also think that as a reviewer, making that first page really count, really saying something that's novel and really describing how your project is novel in that first page makes a big difference, because what happens is that first page sets a tone, and if it's a 15-pager or even if it's a 2-pager, you want to get your idea out there and really start to convince the reviewer early on. So those are some of the big ones. The other things that, when I've reviewed for that have been big dings for me are, one, we look at expertise of the personnel involved, and I think Angela had referred to sort of that really important need to think broadly in terms of the expertise on your team. And that's a really important thing that I've looked out for, and I've dinged different proposals on. Also, sort of independence of your evaluation and the research team itself, because you don't want those two to be too close together, or else it doesn't feel like you're going to have an independent evaluation of the project.
I think that's those are excellent points. I think that reviewers really like to see a personnel team and institutional resources that give them confidence that you're going to be able to pull off the project. I just want to emphasize that, re-emphasize that. That's a great point. And I guess being objective about your own abilities and your own standing in the field within that particular content area, I guess, is most professors I know aren't very good about, objectively evaluating their own, skills. We either over-evaluate ourselves or we under-evaluate it, and there's no premium for modesty in grant proposals, but they also don't care for exaggeration. And if you don't have all of that, all those skills and experiences yourself, find that somewhere else. Put in a research design consultant who's the #1 person in the field in that area for $750 a day for 3 days a year. It doesn't cost much in the overall budget, but then you get that person's resume in there, show them as him or her as a main part of your team. I think that's really important. The resources at the institution are very important in most proposals as well, and they want to see the fullest accounting of the resources, the vast resources really that we have here at Kent State, I think is important. They also like to see cost effectiveness in terms of the budget and a realistic budget. Sometimes, and the balance between under-promising and over-promising, you want to be right there in the middle. If it doesn't look like you're promising enough outcomes or outputs for the proposal, then it doesn't look very cost-effective. If it looks like you're proposing too much in the way of activity and outcome, then you're viewed as unrealistic. And so making sure that your objectives and outcomes are tied to personnel time, but also to budget dollars, I think is very, very important. But putting together that team of personnel that is the very best suited for the particular project you have in mind, I think is really important, and we've alluded to that a couple of times. I think I just can't emphasize that enough. And also by bringing other people in and having their perspectives in the proposal, it always improves it and makes it better. And so you're capitalizing on the expertise of those people you're bringing on. It's not just done in name. It makes the proposal better. It makes your proposal more viable. And also when the project comes in, it makes it much better. It's easier to execute with the really the highest qualified team you can find.
Yeah, and I can add to that just briefly. I always, tell my students when they're writing, because we have them write a lot of grant proposals over here in exercise science, so they can get practice with that. I think one thing, along with what Lisa was saying in the first page, you have to convince them of the so what. We've all done really cool projects, we have really cool ideas, but you need to make sure that you convince the funding agency that what you're showing is going to make a difference, either in the population that you're studying or in, the education of the population or in the quality of life of the individuals. You need to think of the grants along those lines. They need to be able to say with your results one way or the other is going to make a difference, for this population or a difference in the way things are done. That's what they want to fund. They just don't want to fund cool ideas because they're cool. They want to fund ideas that are going to make a difference.
All right, so I'm going to combine our last two questions into one question, and so you can either respond to one or the other or kind of work them together. And really we've been doing this, I think, throughout. So either you can respond to what tips would you give to other grant writers, or what do you wish that you had known earlier in your grant writing career? And so we'll go around and hear from everybody and then see what final thoughts we might have.
I think I would just emphasize things that have already been said, like, for example, what Angela just said about it has to be an idea that's going to make a difference somehow, some way. The point about being very specific and concrete and detailed to show the funder that you have a really solid plan, that you know what you're doing, is really important. And then the final thing that's already been said that I would emphasize is get experience before you write your first grant by working with others who are on a grant-funded project. Somehow find a way to learn about the process and get some real-world experience with grants before setting off to do it.
One of the things I would suggest, and I still have to remind myself of this as time goes on, is don't get discouraged. It's a very competitive time right now in terms of grant money. The federal government doesn't have the resources in education, health, and human services like it used to, both in real dollars and adjusted dollars with other priorities that our government has had. Grants are more competitive than they've ever been, and that's true with foundations as well. So it may be the case that you have to write more proposals in order to get one funded. And I think to be persistent is very important. Take those reviewers' comments to heart, and don't be insulted or offended if they don't like an idea, kind of like when you submit an article for consideration in a professional journal. Take your ego out of that, and if it's not funded and they give you suggestions to improve it and you can re-enter the competition, do that. Don't ever put a good idea away on the shelf. Keep modifying it, keep changing it, and be persistent. But losing feels worse than winning feels good in some ways, and it can be very discouraging. But the resources that come with a funded project as your margin for creativity and the kind of work that you like to do can be very rewarding. But I think persistence is the key, and finding these different ways and different avenues. If one doesn't work, then go to another, get another group of people involved, that kind of stuff, and find out who's doing the same kind of work that you're interested in, making those collaborative linkages as well. But I think persistence really pays off in this fairly competitive grants environment that we're in right now.
I guess I can add to that. I mean, most of the things that I have gotten funded have failed for funding at least one time prior. To really take that feedback, because that can be really powerful and helpful, and guide you into how to better communicate your idea and how you're going to actually enact it. If I were giving advice, and some things that I also wish I knew earlier, I wish, one, grant writing takes a lot of time. So if you're going to write grants, you kind of need to have, that's the icing on the cake in a lot of ways, because your probability of funding is so low relative to your probability for acceptance for your manuscripts. So you want to have sort of your ducks in a row on the publication side, and then apply for grants, because you can apply for a lot of grants and not get funded when your papers would most likely get accepted one way or another. So be really mindful about that. I also think I didn't know how much, once you start getting grants and they're awarded, how much work it takes to actually administer them, and kind of some of the institutional supports that you need here to actually enact some of those grants. And I don't think that was something that I was aware of before. It seemed like all the energy goes into grant writing, and then you don't realize what grant implementation is going to be like. And I know Kent State is continuing to improve upon its infrastructure for administering grants as well, but that was something that I don't think I was fully prepared for at all once I actually was awarded something.
Yeah, grant writing and grant management, they're two different skills, and not everyone has both of them in the same quantity, if that makes sense. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and it also then, I think, really underscores the importance of choosing those proposals that you know you're going to be able to implement, because that's you know, I think a really important piece of that as well. Thinking about the publication and the grant writing and the time that it comes, I think it's also important to every extent possible. Think of ways to kill two birds with one stone. Can the literature review section, the needs and important statements from your grants, could those be converted into literature review journal articles that can accrue credit to you for your reappointments and promotion and tenure here? The conceptual framework of your study, maybe you're in a field where you have journals that will publish conceptual theoretical pieces, things that are needed to be done, that can set the stage for the research if in fact it does get funded. Not only does that help you in terms of advancing in your career both here and externally, let's say the grant doesn't get funded this time around, but in that same year you publish the literature review section, you know, from it as an article, or you put together the methodology and the conceptual framework into an article that you submit for consideration to, you know, to professionals in your field. Now you've got a cited article of your own to cite to reference in your next grant proposal. So it not only advances you along that line where you may have to regroup and resubmit, which is probably more common than not, but you're also using that time so it isn't just pure speculative time. It results in a tangible product that can help you in terms of your advancement both through the process here at Kent and keep you viable for jobs in your field, in the future in any direction. So I think it's important to think about ways to spend that time. You're spending that time writing a high-quality grant proposal, probably has one or two publishable elements in it, or ideas at least, and articulating those into publications is a great way to make efficient use of the resources it takes to write grant.
That's a great idea. And then lastly, I'll add, I know when I first started writing grants, I was a little afraid to ask for help, from other faculty members in the field, or even other faculty members, at the university who could assist. And I know, recently the Research and Sponsored Programs has tried to develop mechanisms where you can have, they'll actually support to pay an outside reviewer to look at it before you send it out. So take advantage of those things, take advantage of other people at the university to help you with those, to help you maintain the direction and trajectory you need. Don't be afraid to reach out to the program officers or the people who are in charge of those foundation grants. In general, everybody's pretty helpful and pretty nice, so that would be my one piece of advice to start out. Don't think that you have to do this on your own, because it's really hard to do, and you don't need to. There's lots of help out there for you.
All right, so I want to thank everybody and try to wrap up our discussion a little bit. So first I want to thank our panelists for agreeing to join us on the webinar today. I really think that you provided us with a lot to think about, and certainly we haven't answered all questions or all concerns related to the grant writing process, but hopefully we've started that discussion. I also want to thank people for viewing our webinar today, and I can certainly say that all the people on the panel are very approachable people who would be willing to talk with you either through email or in person, and so we hope that you'll continue to ask questions as we move forward. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.